Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Tech Trailblazers, a new series of podcasts here with Analyst from GigaOm. And it is the Tech on Fire podcast, looking to where technologies come from and where it is heading. And I am delighted to be joined today by Logan Andrew Green, who writes on IoT and a number of the other subject areas that GigaOm focuses on. Hello there, Logan. How are you?
Hi, Rose. I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're very welcome. So we're going to talk about IoT, so the Internet of Things. And it would be great just to get a little bit of a backstory to yourself, Logan, and, how you've come to be an analyst and talking about these types of things and how you're seeing IoT and some of the other subject areas that you are involved with.
Yeah, absolutely. First off, my name is Logan Andrew Green. I work as a networking and security analyst for GigaOm. We're actually in the process of formalizing our research on IoT, so we should be shortly be publishing some new reports on the area.
Great.
Other than that, I've also been working with Vodafone, and for non-European listeners, Vodafone is a telecommunications company based mainly from the UK, mainly in Europe and Middle East and Africa. Mm-hmm. I worked there as a cloud and security portfolio manager. And before that, I've actually held a couple of engineering roles.
Great. So you're looking at the market and also the technology, which is perfect.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So perhaps if we sort of dive in and talk a little bit about, how has IoT sort of progressed? Because we were, just talking very generally earlier about, obviously, we run awards and we've had an IoT category for a number of years, but it wasn't there right at the beginning. So we're coming into our 10th edition. So we've been tracking IoT startups for about 7 years. So, how has this all come about and why is it important? And why are we seeing a lot of startups in that space?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think IoT is an interesting one. First off, because it's been around for a while. I think the first connected devices, you had them back in the 80s. I think the first one was the connected toaster or something along those lines. And even though it's been a while since then, I think the fact that you've covered it for the past, let's say, 7 years, it's pretty much the point where it started picking up. And I believe the reason for that is that besides the IoT connectivity, which you could say is fairly straightforward, there is also a lot of advancements around data analytics, cloud computing, and then just general operational activities such as, deploying, onboarding devices, and so on that weren't really readily available back, let's say, in the mid 2000s and so on. So I think it's a combination of things. That's pretty much facilitating the deployment of IoT. And that's why at this point we're seeing a bunch of startups. And also besides startups, you also have all the large telecommunication players leveraging their radio networks. So it's really a mixture of many things, this IoT industry that we're looking at.
Yeah, well, and the telecommunications providers have always been very keen to engage with innovative new organizations as well. And I'm sure along the years have acquired a number of them themselves. So that's good. So where are you seeing that IoT is gaining particular traction at the moment? What kind of use cases are you seeing as being sort of highlighted by the organizations that you are talking about, that you are providing insights for?
Yeah, so I think first off, it's very important to make a distinction between the, let's say, technology used and then the use cases related to those.
Yeah.
I'll get a bit technical in here in the terms of saying that on the one hand, we've got the high data transfer, low latency applications, and those are typically supported by, as I said, telecoms providers, especially with new technologies such as 5G and so on. And you can have use cases such as connected cars or remote controls or drone surveys or edge computing and stuff like that. And on the other hand, you've got a completely different set of use cases, which is mainly based around low data transfers. And those would be your sensors, for example. So let's say you want to build a smart city or a smart factory, anything like that. You wouldn't necessarily be interested in having like very high data transfer, expensive and hard to maintain infrastructure like we do with other industries. And I've seen a lot of movement within the low data transfer, particularly with low-powered wide area networks. And because we've got, from the electromagnetic spectrum, we've got an unlicensed bit of it. Anybody can use it, so you don't need to buy a license like the large telecom operators do, which are typically very expensive. So you can use the unlicensed spectrum, which also is what Wi-Fi uses and so on. And smaller companies can build their own technologies within that space and then have some real impact on those use cases that focus on, for example, monitoring and sensoring.
Yeah. And you've mentioned two different sort of, from a technology perspective, instances, the high throughput, lots of data, and the other one, which is very much low throughput of data. What kind of industries are you seeing picking up on those two separate types of IoT?
I don't think in the whole IoT space that there is an industry that's not going to be interested in taking it, which would make sense, because it's something that you look at futuristic movies and you see everything connected. It's exactly the thing that's going to get us there. And let's say for the low data transfer, you would be looking mainly at monitoring applications. So as I mentioned, smart cities, let's say you want to have your smart parking meters or air quality monitoring and so on. You've got agriculture, you've got industrial IoT, so I think within the manufacturing or heavy industries. Smart buildings, for example, would be another use case. And then on the other spectrum, where you have the high data transfers, there's a lot of movement within automotive. So those would be your connected cars. And it's not necessarily just self-driving, but something that would enable cars to receive high throughputs of data.
Yeah.
And some other interesting applications, for example, would be remote surgery. So this would be something, for example, with 5G, you can have a medical practitioner, a doctor or surgeon, that would be in a completely different space and then operating within on a patient with minimal latency, and it would all be done remotely.
So, I mean, that's interesting, because that was one of my other questions, was talk about 5G and that, how that will transform, the adoption element of it and what's possible, because obviously we're talking about unbelievable transfer of data speeds and whatnot with regards to that. You see, 5G has obviously is the buzzword in the mobile space right now. But it's not, we have devices, but the infrastructure itself hasn't quite got there yet, in the same way as we were talking about, the ability to have home access to the internet. We haven't quite got there with 5G. Do you see that as being something that will be moving forward? If we're looking 10 years ahead, are we going to have ubiquitous 5G then? Bit future gazing for you.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. And the reason for that is it could be yes and it could be no. Yeah. And the reason for that is 5G is, first off, very expensive. Yeah. And then second, because it's within that higher frequency band, it means it doesn't propagate as far as lower frequencies do. And you also have got line of sight issues, so that you're not necessarily able to penetrate buildings and so on. So there are definitely places where you can have 5G as a driving force for innovation and so on. But whether you are on top of a mountain, do you need 5G connection there? Now my gut feeling says no. And would you have a lot of money being invested to provide 5G on top of the mountain? Again, my gut feeling says no. That doesn't mean that it's not going to be widespread. It's definitely going to be present in most metropolitan areas. It's just a matter of, lower density, lower population areas. Do you need 5G there? And if you do, then what's the cost to actually do that? And on the other hand, just to circle back to the IoT discussion, when you've got those low... Sorry, that was my doggy there.
Oh, hello. Not an internet of dogs there. You haven't got him connected up there by any way, and you can get him to have a little bark when you need.
No, it's a fully alive dog.
Good.
So I was saying that long range IoT, for example, that uses that lower end of the spectrum, you can really have wide coverage with that. So you can have nationwide coverage for small data transfers, and it can be on top of the mountain at a pretty low cost. So yes, I think that within the IoT space, you've got multiple use cases with multiple underlying technologies that would complement each other. And there's a lot of movement in that, and I think both smaller startups and then larger telecom players are really focusing on getting some partnerships to make sure that they don't miss out on any of those selling points.
Yeah, and obviously that's one of the areas that we're going to see the startup activity being, where they're able to, perhaps not necessarily on the 5G as well, but certainly on those unrestricted bands, those parts of the spectrum, to use that, for example, with Wi-Fi and such like. So I think what you were saying very much is very much mirrors the way that we see things like, fiber connectivity and other types of connectivity in the communication space. It will start in those, shall we say, in the urban jungle well before it would even be considered for like a real jungle, for example. Are we seeing... Well, I suppose this brings us into another part. You've talked about IoT being one of your areas, but obviously security is an area that you also spend a lot of time thinking about. Is security going to be part of the challenge, really, for widespread adoption of IoT? Because, we're talking about billions potentially already of devices that are connected. And, security is obviously going to be an element of that, because that will always be that the majority of them will be connected to the core network, even if they are, working on the edge.
Yeah, well, security is definitely a hot topic. And simply put, without security, adoption is very, very unlikely. And I think with IoT is especially important with security, because when you have a lot of let's say, cheaper device manufacturers that would skip security altogether just to have a product roll out in the market, that's where you have your main issues. And those are typically consumer-oriented and connect through Wi-Fi, for example. So with IoT, it's very important to have security baked in the protocols that you're using. For example, you can have your narrowband Internet of Things, or you can have your LoRa. And those have encryption pretty much baked in the transmission from the sensor to like the gateway or the base station. And while it's not a silver bullet that's going to fix anything, having that inherited security within the IoT protocol itself is definitely going to make it much easier to have confidence in doing IoT deployments. It's also a matter of the data that you're transmitting. For example, it could be data that's not necessarily valuable to hackers. For example, I was mentioning air quality monitoring. You can probably see that information available for free online. Do you really want to break into it? The other question would be if you gain access to those networks that you're not able to do any kind of lateral movement. So there are many facets to security, and obviously the enterprise IT security space will have to expand to include IoT as well. And that's going to be a completely new set of challenges, mainly because of the sheer volume of connected devices that we're going to see. I've seen estimates over the past how many years that is going to reach like 20, 30, 40, 50 billion or so on, like 5-6 devices connected per one person. Well, this is not necessarily niche at the moment. It's the volume of connected devices is going to be one of the big challenges that we'll have to face from a security standpoint.
Yeah, and as you say, that there will not necessarily be the standards that they're all adhering to. The manufacturer is very much focused on being able to do what they're supposed to be doing at that endpoint, rather than worrying about what happens to the data. And I mean, do we see this as being a privacy element? I mean, we talked about the hack into the Amazon Ring sort of fancy doorbell that people have. So that could be on a sort of a personal level, could be used as an entry point on targeted individuals. But against an organization per se, that's not going to be as much of an issue from what you're saying, because there will be that the core infrastructure will be handling security of data that's transmitted and also at rest once it's within that sort of more secure environment. Are we going to see that as being, that's not necessarily going to be something that's going to be, shall we say, giving, there's not going to be lost sleep from individuals per se with regards to that, but there could be a knock-on effect into the corporate security environment from that. We've seen that to a degree with this working from home, that more things are in a sort of a bit more in the wild with individuals. Do you see that is going to start to become an issue, or do you think that will still be handled pretty well by the core elements of the network itself?
I think the short answer to this would be that security at every single point will be important. So whether that's the device manufacturer making sure they implement their security protocols, user access management, the core transmission of data, the processing of the data, everything is going to be important in security. So I don't think there is one area where we can say, this is actually not such a high risk, because being quite early in the development of IoT, we don't know what kind of implications that would have. And you mentioned privacy before. Yes, I think privacy is definitely a big issue that we need to be aware of, especially in the consumer space, but also in enterprise. There's going to be some use cases that are going to touch personal information from end users. So yeah, I think all around we need to make sure that security is taken seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. So what kind of things do you think are we going to be talking about? If we roll forward 10 years, if we do this interview again then, what kind of things do you anticipate we're going to be discussing? What are going to be the challenges, and what will have happened perhaps a bit more difficult? Obviously, looking backwards in the rearview mirror on IoT is something that you're well positioned to do. And this is a little bit more of a stretch, isn't it, to see where things may develop?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I think I'll need to have a quick think about it. But what immediately comes to mind would be saturation within metropolitan areas. And I don't think that's necessarily an immediate threat, but in high density areas, we might start running into issues about, channel communications and overlapping between devices that want to talk to a gateway or a base station. So that might be a bit down the line, let's say maybe 10 years from now, but it's definitely something that we need to keep in mind. And then what could be in the near future, I think it's all going to be around the deployment and management of those IoT networks and solutions. So as I've mentioned, we haven't really seen, explosive growth in the enterprise IoT space because it was quite difficult to have, let's say, one vendor that can help you with everything and make sure that the deployment of hardware is smooth, that the onboarding is going fine, that once you collect the data, you have what to do with it. That's a very big one. So as those get more mature, then we're going to see more players starting to look at IoT as an opportunity for business intelligence rather than just having a connected device. I mean, yeah, it's okay to monitor, for example, how full a rubbish can is, for example. But it's also important to develop applications that once that rubbish can is full, you can send a notification, for example, to the estates department, and then they can come and sort it out. And it's those types of developments that I think are really going to push IoT forward, making sure that we have actionable insights and it's done in a user-friendly way, pretty much.
Because as you say, I mean, data is just data. You need to turn it into knowledge that's powerful and that can be used.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah. So what other things do you think are bubbling away that are going to be something that's going to be getting your attention that you're starting to track? Because obviously you look at, where the established players in this market are, but what kind of things are you kind of starting to see perhaps in the smaller, the bit more of the tech trailblazers type of organizations, the startups in the IoT space?
Yeah, I think we've touched upon a few of those already. You mentioned at one point edge computing, and I think that's a really key one. So with edge computing, you can really offload the processing from the end device onto, let's say, a more powerful machine that sits in relative proximity to that end device, and that's especially the case with IoT, and combining that with mobile edge computing, for example, and 5G, it's really going to give us some new use cases. So besides edge computing, which could also work hand in hand with artificial intelligence and machine learning, for example, you can have a surveillance camera, and you can have a computer vision algorithm on that recognizes faces, for example, rather than having a bulky camera that needs to do all of that. You can have it in a remote place, a small camera that's connected via a 5G network, and then all the processing is being done off the device, and then the data from that can be sent to whatever intelligence application you need to use. So that's one area. And then what I've also observed a lot of people working on is making sure that they have those partnerships, and it's partnerships across the technology landscape. So at this point, you can't really have any kind of technology that's not deeply integrated with whatever everybody else is doing. So you need to be able to have some sort of way of communicating with cloud service providers, for example. You need to make sure you have the device manufacturers on board. You need to work with system integrators to deploy solutions. And it's also a matter of having your technology to be vendor agnostic. So you might develop as a startup your own protocol, but if you're the only one who's using it compared to some competitors who are using multiple protocols, even though they have some proprietary ones developed, you're going to fall short because you don't really know what kind of requirements your customers are going to have and what kind of systems they already have in place. So the person who has the vendor who has most flexibility in this area is definitely going to have the upper hand.
Yeah, I think that's really important, both with the bigger established players and with other startups as well, because sometimes you have a piece of a puzzle which on its own may be useful, but if you put it with something else that's being developed, you could have a killer app or a killer device or a killer solution, shall we say, that can revolutionize things. And that's going to be important. We've certainly seen ourselves that not so much in the IoT space, but we've had tech trailblazers who have acquired other ones to bring that into their portfolio. So I think we'll be seeing a lot of activity in that space as well, both acquisition of IoT players by the larger incumbents, but also, perhaps those smaller players kind of coming together to provide a richer portfolio that perhaps ticks more boxes, both from the enterprise and the consumer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's going to be a matter of being able to sell your solution globally as well. Mm-hmm. You want to have your partner ecosystem to span as many geographical areas as you can. And there is a lot of players who've started doing that. I think it's quite tempting, especially when you start off as a smaller company, to just have your network operating within one geographical area, or to be able to support solution deployments just in that one area. But the further out you can span, you're going to be able to have many more opportunities.
Yeah, and I mean, you seeing any regions that are particularly driving this, that perhaps are what you'd see as being a bit further ahead? Maybe there's wider adoption of 5G or wider availability of 5G, that maybe that's marrying up in those regions.
So I'm fairly surprised. Usually, the USA leads in pretty much everything that's tech related, but for those cases specifically, I'm seeing a lot of players in France, Germany, Netherlands, and Belgium. So those areas, especially France, I think there's a lot of focus on IoT there, and they've also got some powerful incumbent operators. For example, Orange. Not only do they have their own carrier network that they can support IoT from, but they also use unlicensed with LoRaWAN, so they can support deployments in that area as well. So I think especially in France particularly, they're quite ahead of many other players. But yeah, I've seen a lot of startups and movement in those 4 countries in particular. Yeah. Now, I should also mention China, because China is, by absolute numbers, the leading country with connected devices. I don't have a lot of insight about what they use and how they do it, but they're definitely up there.
Yeah, definitely. So we're going to see a lot of activity. How do you feel that the US will fare in that? No, I wouldn't say it's battle of IoT, but do you think that that's something that they can? Is that an infrastructure thing, or do you think that they're just focusing a lot of their innovation in other areas?
The US is not behind by any means. It's just that I haven't seen them to be the driving force behind IoT at this point specifically. And I think it's mainly because the USA is a very big country, whereas, for example, Netherlands is very small. So they have a much easier time deploying IoT networks. So yeah, I think the US is going to make progress quite quickly. There's definitely important players in the US, and they've got some of the biggest operators worldwide. I expect that before deploying IoT networks within the major population centers, that the rural deployment will be delayed compared to other smaller countries. And I think that's kind of the nature of the technology. You can't really expect them to invest billions and billions to create a network that spans the whole country and then have very slow adoption.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you need to make it commercially viable. And as you say, in some of the smaller countries, you can roll it out much more swiftly and therefore get that ability to have it pay off quicker, which obviously would be helpful. So IoT moving forward, are there other things that we should be keeping an eye out, or other things that we'll start to see play out over the coming years?
In terms of what I think people that are interested in deploying IoT solutions should keep in mind is that I think IoT, especially for myself, I thought it's quite intuitive at first. You have your device, you connect it to the internet, and that's pretty much it. but the supply chain is fairly intricate. So it's important whenever you're interested in deploying those networks that you either, if you decide to do it in-house, do adequate research to know what the steps are to deploying it, or partner with a reputable systems integrator. And I think the challenge with the first one especially is that all the literature that I've seen available at the moment, it's either very technical or very high level. So for example, with the technical one, they can you can find out why sensors use AES 128 instead of AES 256 as the encryption. But in terms of usefulness, when you look to deploy something, that's not your go-to information, right? So this is one of the challenges that I'm trying to tackle with the GigaOm research. So I'm really trying to make sense of what the supply chain looks like, and then what an IT buyer needs to know to deploy one of those solutions. And it might be just as easy as partner with the right systems integrator, and they're going to pretty much hold your hand to deploy the whole IoT solution. But it's very important to make sure that you're aware of the vertical that you're in, of what sensors and devices are available, of what your use cases are. And then when it comes to the backend infrastructure, let's say the network management and whatever protocols you're going to use, while that's important, I think it should be taken not as the main decision factor in terms of how can I deploy this, because you can achieve one use case with multiple protocols. So rather than getting stuck on, let me understand this very low level technical detail between why this is good and why this is bad, for example, it's important to start with the use case and then work your way back. And then after you have everything mapped out, that you select the right protocol for your needs. And chances are they're going to be multiple.
That's great. I mean, certainly from what you're saying, it's important for particularly the small players who have maybe a part of a solution or a solution which has a very specific use case, is to look at how they fit into the bigger ecosystem, and then partner appropriately with for example, systems integrators who have a specialization in an area where their technology is particularly relevant and useful. But that's obviously something that they all should be considering, if that's rather than endpoint sales, is to look at how they fit into the bigger picture. So is there anything else that you think would be useful to share around looking at the future of IoT?
I guess it would be just in terms of sustainability of your solution. You want to make sure that whenever you do a deployment, that you're not going to rip and replace everything every 3 to 5 years, right? So you want to have something that's going to be sustainable in the long term, so you can afford to invest that capital up front, so you can have your returns over time rather than going through the whole process all the time. I don't think that's going to be necessarily the case. I don't foresee anything that's going to be revolutionary in terms of a completely new protocol or some players completely shaking up the industry. I think the environment we see at the moment is fairly strong, it's fairly comprehensive, and it's just a matter of really making sure that whenever those solutions are deployed, they're deployed with the use case in mind. And I think one I wouldn't necessarily say piece of advice, because it's been mostly an observation, as most people are doing it. Whenever new players are developing their solutions or their technology stack and so on, if they focus on being vendor agnostic, like most of them are, that's the first step. And then looking at verticals and industry specific applications, that's the second step. And at that point, it's good to bring in partners that have experience in those industries. So for example, it's better to develop a agnostic solution in the beginning, and then work with some people who are experienced, for example, in manufacturing, to make sure that you can deliver solutions in that area.
Okay, very good. Well, that was brilliant. So anything else you'd like to add for the conversation that we've had here so far, Logan?
No, not really. I think we've exhausted quite a few topics at a high level, at least.
We've covered a lot of ground there. We have covered a lot of the IoT space for sure. Well, that's brilliant. Thank you so much for your time. You guys have been listening to the new Tech on Fire podcast that we're doing in conjunction with GigaOm, and I'm delighted to have been joined today by Logan Andrew Green.
Thanks for having me, Rose. I really appreciate it.
No problem at all. So, if you've enjoyed this, please do follow us on Twitter at Tech Trailblaze or find us on LinkedIn. Thanks again to Logan, and we look forward to joining you for future Tech on Fire podcasts.